Hey guys, welcome back to my series on documented miracles. I'm your host, Caleb Jackson, and today we're going to be looking at a specific instance of a miracle instead of what I usually do, which is compilations and various case studies. Now, I'm cheating a little bit because I have discussed this case before in a previous video. It's actually part one, although there I discussed it fairly briefly. And I've decided to give it its own episode, its own video, just because I think it's so unique, and it is, at least in my opinion, what I'll try to be arguing, perhaps one of the best, if not the best, and most compelling miracle in human history. We'll go over why that is in just a second. So without further ado, let us discuss this miracle. Now, as you can see by the title of this video, it does involve an amputee. God does heal amputees. This is the most impressive miracle in history. Now, we do hear this a lot, right? If people can be healed of blindness and deafness and paralysis, why doesn't God restore lost limbs? Why is this something that seems hard to do? And why is it also the idea that this can't be psychosomatic, that the most evidential miracles we would expect are the ones that, well, we don't see that often? And these are interesting objections. But that's why we're trying to take analysis of look at a case to see if this really has happened in real life. So a little bit of background first on miracle claims. Every major, well, at least monolithic, monotheistic religion in that area has some kind of miracle claim. So in Judaism, the big miracle is the parting of the Red Sea that leads the Israelites into Israel. Muhammad's night journey in Islam, where he gets to meet the prophets of old and rides on a winged horse from Jerusalem. Of course, more modern history is Joseph Smith's golden plates, which had a handful of witnesses, some of whom saw an angel and 8 others who said that they felt and touched the place. And of course, the most famous miracle of all and most influential would be the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And typically you'll hear apologists talk about this one a lot when they talk about miracles. They often don't discuss individual cases. They typically will focus on the resurrection. This is the case of people like Tim McGrew, William Lane Craig, Gary Habermas, Michael Licona, and others who focus on the resurrection as the chief miracle. And this language is not alone either. We even see more skeptical and atheistic scholars saying this. So, for example, Anthony Flew, who was, at least in his day, one of the most prominent atheist philosophers of the 20th century, although he later became a deist right before he died, said, "The evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstandingly different in quality and quantity." Now, the point of this video is not to necessarily disagree with Flew as to whether the evidence for the resurrection is consistent. That's a case for its own video, and there are plenty of videos on YouTube, as well as scholarly literature discussing the resurrection and whether one finds it persuasive. However, what we will push back on is the idea of demonstrable evidence in terms of quantity and quality. So for the resurrection, regardless of where you stand, we have a couple eyewitnesses. People who are less optimistic will say we have one, which is Paul. Paul lists others as well in that list. At least we have one firsthand account. If you think the Gospels were transcribed by the authors associated with the Gospels, then we'd have 2 more with Matthew and John, and adding Luke and Mark as secondary sources who may have known eyewitnesses. And of course, 500, but these 500 that Paul mentions, we just don't have much detail. So with the resurrection, we don't know the exact number of witnesses. We can speculate. And our accounts are written a few years after the event, firsthand, which isn't bad. The Gospels may be a little bit later, and there's other factors like persecution and so forth. So I don't think the evidence for the resurrection is bad. However, we need to look at other elements that could make it a miracle influential. So what I'll be arguing is that the miracle of Kalanda, which we'll be discussing today, is unique. And in my opinion, I think the evidence historically would be superior because of many factors. So for one, it is an earlier case. This is from the 17th century, which may not seem that early, but in comparison to something from antiquity 2,000 years ago, it's quite recent. Because it's so recent, this happened at a time after the printing press was invented. We have a lot of primary sources for this. We have immediate and early primary sources, some of which were even written within days of the days or weeks of the intentional miracle. We also have dozens of eyewitnesses from all walks of life. This includes royalty and hostile witnesses, such as foreigners and Anglicans. We'll discuss that in a minute as well. We have a year-long investigation, which includes medical verification and documentation. We have impossible conditions with no chance of misdiagnosis. One may accidentally mispronounce someone dead. That has happened in Victorian England and other places. But there's no real way you could misidentify someone as missing an arm or a leg. And of course, we actually have physical evidence left over as well, evidence that we could still look at today and observe. Unless one believes the Holy Sepulchre is the site of Christ, we don't really have anything physical, potentially an empty tomb if that were to be authentic, but that doesn't tell us much. Like ours with the Shroud of Turin, which, if authentic, would be physical evidence for the resurrection, but this is very highly disputed and debated. So let's look at the actual case, though. So Miguel Picer was a 20-year-old or adolescent Spaniard living in the 17th century. In 1637, he got in a cart accident where the wheel ran over his leg and broke it, and this caused gangrene. And so he visited the hospital in Valencia, and they tried to treat his leg, but this was no avail. So he decided to go to the hospital in Zaragoza, which is several miles away, and traveled there, which was a couple days' journey because he was injured. And at Zaragoza, they decided that they couldn't treat the leg, and so they would have to amputate it. So two surgeons, Juan de Estanga and Diego Miurello, sawed the leg off. Then they burnt the stump with fire to prevent the bleeding and treated that. Then they went and buried the leg in the courtyard, as was routine practice. After that, Juan de Estanga treated the wounds of the stump for several months, and Miguel would routinely come back for additional cures as well. Yeah, so Miguel became a beggar in Zaragoza. He was very well known. He would beg in front of the cathedral, the pillar to Our Lady of the Pillar of Zaragoza. And one source mentions that Miguel would ride his donkey to the neighboring villages in quest for alms. To arouse pity, he would show off the stump of his cut off leg. Villagers would see him rubbing holy oil on his stump, including his own doctor, who he continued to ask for treatments. He believed that the oil from the lamps in front of the cathedral were holy and blessed by the Virgin Mary, as this was a very Catholic environment, and he hoped that would do something. But he was very well known among the town. Now let's look at the actual miracle. On March 29th, 1640, Miguel's family, and along with a soldier who was housing with him at the time, saw Miguel rubbing his leg with the oil as usual, with the crust starting to form on it, and Miguel complaining of pain, which is not that uncommon. Miguel went to bed early that night around 10 o'clock. And around 11 p.m., his mother goes upstairs and tries not to wake him, but she notices that there are two legs sticking out of the bed. And at first she thinks this is the soldier, because it obviously couldn't be Miguel's, but the more she looks at it, she notices that these 2 feet didn't belong to the soldier. He was in the bed next to her. So soon she pulled the coat away he was using as a blanket, and saw that he indeed had 2 feet, and she woke Miguel up. Miguel woke up. He said that he was dreaming about rubbing his leg with the holy oil of the Virgin Mary, and he was amazed to see that his foot had returned. Notably, the foot was contracted and a little bit shorter by a few centimeters and blue. And for the first few days, he couldn't really put pressure on it and walk. But as time went on, it became normal color and extended length. And typically, this is because when you replant a limb, the blood and circulation have to become flowing again. And so originally, the limb is blue because of blood loss, and the bone is shorter because of the breakage from the amputation. But once the bone heals and once the blood flows back, you'll get a regular looking limb over time. Now, one of the things that makes this miracle more credible is the extensive investigation. So the Archbishop of Zaragoza ordered for an inquiry, which lasted about 11 months to a year. Originally, within the first few days, 10 witnesses were called under oath and were interviewed. But this, when it was taken to another district, added on several more. There were over 20 more who attested, I think around 24. So in total, you have well over 30 witnesses testifying under oath in a trial, being cross-examined, confirming that they did in fact know Miguel. They knew him as both as an amputee and as a beggar, and even before he had it, and now that they could see that he in fact had both legs. This included Miguel's family, who was interviewed, the townsmen of Zaragoza who had seen Miguel as a beggar and were familiar with him, the doctors who originally had amputated the leg and buried it, the clergyman of the church of the cathedral that he would beg in front of, among many others. And Miguel had an official license to beg as well. That's important, because begging without a license was a felony, because some people could pretend to be sick or pretend to be poor and not take advantage. So Miguel had been given an official license to beg in Zaragoza, and this was all confirmed to make sure that nothing was afoot. Now, the two doctors who testified, I actually did quote from the original documents of the trial in my original video. For the sake of redundancy, I'm not going to do that again. However, I will give a quote from one of the hospital staffers at the time, which I didn't mention last time. And this is the man who actually buried the leg. So this is Juan Lorenzo Garcia. He was a hospital staffer, and he testified that he had seen the leg amputated and he buried it. So he says, He saw the patient, which is Miguel, had taken from the Quadra de Aventuras, who seems to him to be the one who has been shown to him, whom he does not know by name, only did he see him with a wounded leg. The dean saw the leg cut, the same that has been shown to him of Migan Juan Piecero. The depositor is the one who took the leg after being cut and took it with another companion of his. And having been with her in the chapel, they took the leg to bury it. They buried it, making a hole like a handful of wave, and this is said to be true under oath. They actually put the leg in a box and then dug a hole about 8 inches deep, if I remember correctly, and buried it there, as was the typical practice with amputated limbs. Now, what was interesting about the leg is that this wasn't just a new leg. This was actually what appeared to be his original leg. And when they looked at the leg that had appeared, this leg had the same birthmarks, same scars, same dog bite marks, etc., on it from prior to the amputation. And what was really interesting is they noted that there was a significant red circular scar that was pretty deep right below the leg, which is where he had been amputated. And this is actually consistent with what we know about modern examples of limb replantation. So the picture here, you can see that big red mark on the leg. Now in Miguel's case, it was more below the right below the knee and not nearly so down, but this is just a modern example of what that would look like. So something along this lines was described, which is pretty significant, and again implies that the leg really had been cut off and the scar was there. And modern leg and limb replantation surgery was not really invented until the 20th century, so this was not a thing back in the 17th century. So investigation. So there was a local newspaper at the time as well that mentioned that when the investigators went to the hospital courtyard to dig up the box, they found the box, which the earth around it had been uncovered, or had not been disturbed. They uncovered it and they opened it, and there was no leg in there. And so they were under the impression that the leg had actually vanished from the box and reappeared back on Miguel's foot because it had the same marks. And we have a couple examples of this in general. Now, this is from the 19th century, but we have examples of gravestones where people bury their amputated legs. And in Catholicism, because they believed in the resurrection, it was important to bury amputated limbs and preferably bury them with the body. So if someone died, they might have to rebury it up to place it with them. And the example down here is actually something that we discovered in Peru between the 13th and 15th centuries. Now, this was, I think, for punishment, not for medical purposes, but we do have evidence that people were amputating limbs back this far, and that often that their amputated limbs were buried, sometimes with their bodies, in a grave. So that just might be the example to look for when imagining that scenario. So after that investigation, the Archbishop eventually declared this to be an official miracle that happened on the intercession of the Virgin Mary, Our Lady of the Pilar. And Miguel Piecero became an instant local celebrity. And he actually got to meet the King of Spain, who was Philip IV at the time. And as the testimonies go, although this one's a bit more contentious, is that King Philip actually got down on his knees and kissed Miguel's healed leg as a sign to the Virgin Mary. And that's quite a sign to see the king of the Spanish Empire bowing and kissing the leg of a peasant. And this event, as far as the Miguel getting to meet the king, was witnessed by Anglican ambassadors, which is interesting. And they actually reported this back to the King of England, and the King of England was open to this, although many Anglicans there criticized him for being too gullible and saying that this had to be some kind of Catholic trick. But we do have that. We also have German doctors who saw this and tested. So there were multiple foreigners who saw this and seemed to be convinced by it when they had witnessed it. All right, the transcript of the trial is one of the sources that's the most important of the primary sources, but we have plenty of other ones as well. We have pamphlets that were created 1 or 2 years after the incident, many by foreign doctors. Again, a German doctor is one of them. We have plenty of journal and diary entries from the time, including from a cardinal who is visiting, both from believers and skeptics like Anglicans overseas who had heard about the case. We have local contemporary newspapers, as mentioned previously, mentioning the case. We have the proceedings from the King's Court and the writings of the ambassador who was visiting Spain at the time. We have paintings that were made only a handful of years later depicting this miracle and depicting angels and the Virgin Mary reattaching the leg onto Miguel's stump. We have the hospital admission slip to know that Miguel was originally admitted into the hospital of Valencia when he had originally broken his leg, and many, many more. Those are just the primary ones, but the transcript of the trial is the most important, and I will actually put the link down in the description for that. It is in Spanish, and it's a copy of the original one. The original one, I believe, was lost during one of the world wars, but the copy existed alongside the original for lots of time, and so we know that it hasn't been altered or changed. So I'll put that in the link. Hopefully, if you know someone who knows Spanish, that can help out, or Google Translate might be helpful, although it is 17th century Spanish, so just keep that in mind. In modern discussion, something that doesn't get said a lot with this is that we have reports that the skeleton of Miguel was exhumed in 1950 from what's believed to be his traditional gravesite. And when they did the exhumation, they saw that the right leg, which is the one that Miguel had claimed to have amputated, was 5.5 millimeters shorter than the left one. And usually this happens when bone breaks and heals. It doesn't always, it's a little bit shorter just from the breakage. And the orthopedic shoes and the clothing imply that whoever the skeleton belonged to probably would have had a limp for most of his life. And so the healing was there, but there might have been a little incompleteness next to that of the right tibia. I will also attach this document, which I have here, but you won't be able to read it. It's also in Spanish. But again, Google Translate or someone you know might be able to help you out with that. I will also attach that in the description if you would like to read it for yourself. It's a brief discussion of the exhumation and the findings. Although this can't prove for certain that Miguel really was amputated and got a leg back, there's nothing about it that contradicts it. It's perfectly consistent with that notion. All right, so what about alternative explanations? How did people react to this? How did people do this? Because with any major miracle claim, including the resurrection, you're going to have different theories, naturalistic ones to explain away the evidence. And so with this case, as we've already said, there's quite a bit of primary evidence. I would say more than pretty much any other case, and the conditions make this interesting. So what are some of the solutions? Well, the earliest ones and the most common one from the 18th century, 17th century, and so forth, was just a priori dismissal. And this was from secular people and also Anglicans as well, very anti-Catholic rhetoric at the time, who dismissed this as a trick of the papacy because we know that the Catholic Church is bogus and this can't happen. You see this especially among people like Butler, Paley, Campbell, etc., who were modern defenders of Christianity, but they were also critics of Catholics. David Hume famously mentions this case fairly briefly, and he, to paraphrase him pretty closely, says that the burden of proof was not on him to show that this was a falsehood. He could dismiss this because he knows that testimony supported by a miracle supported by any human testimony is more likely to be flawed and more likely to be mistaken than it is for the laws of nature to have been overturned. And so Hume is not trying to propose an alternative theory. He is just saying that with all probability, we should expect this is some kind of hoax, because that's just more likely than a miracle. We won't go into the specifics of Hume's argument in this episode, but there are plenty of resources out there to decide that. But if one is open to the miraculous, one would also have to take that into consideration. Another one, not a very common explanation because it's quite flawed, is the idea that maybe Miguel had a fake leg that didn't actually come back. Maybe he faked this with a wooden leg or some kind of artificial metal or what have you. And William Paley, who is a well-known 18th century apologist, most associated with creating the watch designer argument for God's existence, which would later become the teleological argument, and also for his defense of the Gospels and for the resurrection. While he was a big fan of defending Jesus' miracles, he was not going to defend the Catholic miracles of his time as a devout Anglican. And so Paley suggested that the people would have been so zealous and so dedicated to Catholicism that they wouldn't have bothered to check, and they would have just believed based on hearing, because this already agreed with preconceived notions. And that maybe Miguel had a fake leg that he tricked people with, that this was not anything that came back. And so we can dismiss this as saying that this is simply a peg leg that was maybe decorated. The issues with this theory are more than obvious, and it would take forever to go through all of them, but the descriptions of the leg, the fact that it was carefully examined by everyone present and clearly seemed to be flesh, the fact that we've all the scars, the fact that it'd be pretty easy to decipher between a real flesh leg and a false leg, even in the 17th century, all of those things ruled this as almost impossible as an explanation. More modern examples do the reverse logic. Paley thought that Miguel may have been an actual amputee with a fake new leg, whereas more modern critics say maybe Miguel was never actually amputated at all. Maybe he was a fake amputee. And that's why it's not surprising that the leg that returned was his original leg. So this has been proposed by people like Luigi Garcelli, who's also done a lot of criticism of the Catholic Church and of the Shroud of Turin, most notably, and by online skeptic Brian Dunning. Both of them have various versions of the same theory. They say that Miguel really did break his leg and was admitted to the hospital, but that he didn't actually get it amputated. And so he would fake it by putting it up to his thigh, kind of like a flamingo stance, wrapping it up and faking a disability so that he could get money for begging. And this is what he did for 2 years. And his parents accidentally found out when they walked in on Miguel sleeping and seeing his leg. And before Miguel could say anything, his parents cried, "This is a miracle." And Miguel went along with it because had he not, he could have been severely punished for fraud and for deceiving the employees. So he went with that, and word spread, and this essentially was the greatest hoax of all time. This is also not without serious major issues for anyone who's actually read the sources. So most notably, the surgeons did attest that they actually had amputated the leg. Garla tries to get around this by saying maybe this was false memory. Maybe they misidentified Miguel because this was a big hospital and this happened 2 years before the healing. And so they may have gotten Miguel mixed up with any other countless amputees or operations they'd have to do. This sounds plausible, but it runs into issues when you understand the fact that Miguel was not just a one-time patient who had an operation and left. He was operated on. He was cared for by many months by Juan de Estonga, and he continued to visit Estonga after that, the continuing years as he was a beggar, to get treatments and pain relief and ailments for his wounded leg. So Juan de Estonga and Miguel Pilar were pretty close partners and knew each other fairly well. This was not just some random one-time event. Miguel was a regular at the hospital. So it seems unlikely misidentification happened. Of course, his family couldn't have misidentified him, but now you'd have to wrap up and say maybe the family is lying, and you have to multiply your conspirators. Another issue is that Miguel actually did obtain a license to beg, which was pretty strict back in the day because there were people who did fake illnesses or faked poverty to beg. That is certainly true, but in that medieval period, laws were passed to enforce that, to stop that from happening by requiring licenses. And usually these were pretty strict. Even people who really were disabled or really were poor were denied licenses because of what the church considered immoral behavior like prostitution. And so they would have to review your case and make sure you actually were who you say you were before they granted you a license. And so it seems almost unimaginable they wouldn't have checked Miguel's leg to see if it had really been amputated. So that, among many reasons, is another one to think this is a bad theory. Likewise, by the way, this would add to a persecution complex because this miracle occurred during the Spanish Inquisition, which was very strict on heretics and false prophets and false miracles. If you were caught deliberately faking and deceiving the priests with a false miracle, that could be severely punished. Likewise, with faking a disability to beg, that was also something to be punished. We have other laws in Europe that have similar statutes, and those mention getting up to 200 lashes and so forth. So these were pretty harsh penalties, and so there would be quite a lot of pressure on Miguel's part to make sure that he wasn't going to be persecuted in this way. Of course, many witnesses also not only saw Miguel with the covered stump and the wooden leg, but also saw his stump uncovered and the crust beneath it and all that while he was begging, and he would put the oil on it. Of course, that also doesn't explain why the leg in the courtyard was empty. One could say that the leg was never buried to begin with, but that makes one wonder how they would even begin the investigation to begin with. If Miguel wasn't the only one who was amputated there, they'd have to have some way of identifying and being able to tell apart one decomposed body part for the other. And the fact that it was in a box makes this likely that someone's leg was buried. So then we would just have to ask what happened to that one. So there's all other reasons. And lastly, the circular scar below the knee, what the witnesses described, is very consistent with the leg that was replanted like we see today, but it's not consistent with merely a broken leg. And it wouldn't explain how that effect got on the leg if this was in fact never really cut off. And so that's much more consistent with the hypothesis that the leg actually was removed. So for all those reasons, this is not a very good alternative. And I think it lacks significant explanatory power and scope, and is overall a very bankrupted theory. So going through all of those, we really just have to ask, what is the historical explanation to this? If one is open to miracles, then that seems to be the explanation with the best impact. But I know that I, as myself and many of my Protestant friends, may hesitate to attribute such a wondrous act to the Virgin Mary if you're not a Catholic. So one may have to put certain theological considerations into place when considering this. At the same time, we should be open-minded to the evidence. And if the evidence is strong enough, if the testimony is good enough to confirm a miracle, we should be open to it. And I would propose that in this case, the documentation is so good and the alternative theories are so weak and the possibility for genuine misunderstanding is so low because there's no way you could misdiagnose or misperceive a missing leg, rules out any other alternative. And we may have to say that the best explanation is the miraculous. So I will leave it with that. Please let me know what you think down in the comments, and we'll keep this series going. So thank you all for your time, and have a good night, and God bless.